thank you so much for including us here and of course for subsidizing this project. It's joined with Nirupama Kulkarni, former student here at the real estate group. And to kind of start a little bit from the bigger picture of this project and how it fits in, I would say if there's one thing that unites all the researchers who are part of the LIFT initiative is that we're all interested in understanding how to alleviate financial constraints of underserved populations. But the challenge is, as I think Laura formulated in the leaflets for today's conference about the initiative, is that, well, we also want to be careful to understand unintended consequences of increased access to certain financial tools or financing opportunities. And the application I will give in this paper will not be in Mexico. You know, I actually love it as a finance researcher that I have to justify using US data, because in my world, everything is US centered. But yeah, I will be using US data. I hope that's okay. And it will be about evaluating the effects of eased access to mortgage financing and to home ownership. And the key takeaways at the end of my 12 slides will be that we are pointing to severe unintended consequences of these very well-intended policies due to the endogenous response of the non-minority or non-underserved population groups, resulting deterioration of place-based factors of the areas we're trying to improve. And I think as such, the project points more broadly to the dangers of large-scale implementations, in particular if they're geographically concentrated. Okay, so this is about home ownership, which in particular in this country, you know, is a big deal. Home ownership is part of the American dream, and for at least 150 years, I would say. If I start with the Homestead Act in 1862, more than 150 years, there have been repeated policies trying to help increase home ownership. So you can go every couple of years, every couple of decades, and find another milestone, like the establishment of the Federal Housing Administration in the 30s, HUD 68. The Community Reinvestment Act 77, the so-called GSE Act or Federal Housing Enterprise Safety and Soundness Act, which I will be focusing on today in 92, in this century American Dream Down Payment Initiative. And so why do we think home ownership is such an important thing? Well, there's some research linking it to better outcomes for children in terms of upward mobility, educational attainment, reduced teenage pregnancies. On the finance side, there are links to wealth creation, obviously, you know, forced savings. We like that, as particularly as behavioral researchers, consumption smoothing, financial stability, and researchers like Ed Glazer and Corsas have been pointing to positive externalities. So I own a home, I maybe take care of the area we live in and so forth. And lots of, you know, religious groups and charities emphasize how important it is for a human being to know I have a roof over my head and can rely on not being kicked out of it at any point in random point in time. Now, the issue is, if we look at the historical trends of home ownership in the US, that there is generally an upward trend. So if we believe in all these positive outcomes, good news, but there's a huge discrepancy by race and by socioeconomic groups. So if you start, you know, where I started in around 1870, you had kind of, and I split the US population in white and black will be my main focus of minority group. You have white home ownership somewhere, you know, about 50–55%, black home ownership below 10%. So you have like a 46 percentage points gap in home ownership. That has been narrowing. So today, instead of at 46.4, we're at 28.23. But the really bad news in all of that is that this happened pretty much by 1900. That's when we got to like a home ownership gap of 28%. And since then, all this community reinvestment, GSE Act, etc., they have barely left a dent in like helping minorities to kind of increase their home ownership. And so the question is, why is that happening? People have been trying to calibrate the intended effects, have been really puzzled by the very low impact these dollars spent and effort spent have had, and we are going to be pointing to one explanation which is contributing, we think, to this outcome. So as a result of these failures, where we're still at today is that across the aisle, really, administrations are supporting efforts. So there's a quote from the Clinton administration where it's emphasizing that how minority families, young families, low-income families have to partake in the American dream and become homeowners. George Bush urging his team to kind of close the home ownership gap in America, singling out African Americans and Hispanics. But today, just right now, with Biden's plan for investing in our communities through housing, well, deploring the racial disparities that persist, and again, an effort to try to close the racial wealth gap. And so, trying to understand why that's happening, I'm going to be focusing on the Federal Housing Enterprise Safety and Soundness Act of '92. It's often called the GSE Act. Why? Because the government-sponsored enterprises who basically gives all the liquidity to the mortgage market, got a mandate, a strong mandate in this legislation to increase mortgage financing to areas with a high share of low income and minority groups of the population. There are certain cutoffs, right? If the median income is 0.9 or less relative to the broader, commuting zone income, or it can be a little bit higher, but the high share of minorities, then the GSEs had a mandate to make sure that their portfolio of mortgages they buy from the actual lenders had a mandate to significantly increase the number of mortgages that came from this area. So meaning it became much easier if you live in these areas to get access to a mortgage and become a homeowner. That will be my focus. I will be also in the background taking into account that these GSEs have generally been easing up on which mortgages they fund. There's something called the conforming loan limit, which means only mortgages up to a certain amount are conforming and can be refinanced to the GSEs, and the other ones, the non-conforming ones, are much harder to get, more expensive, etc. And that conforming loan limit has been increasing. So generally in the US, it has become easier, at least in some areas, to become a homeowner. So the question will be, how did these housing policies affect homeownership and the upward mobility of children growing up in these targeted neighborhoods? So I'm going to be looking at homeownership gap, and I'm going to be looking at upward mobility, which I think is the ultimate outcome we're interested in. For sure, I'm interested in. So here are the findings in a nutshell. I only have 15 minutes. First, just looking, what did the GSE Act do to home ownership? If you just take the aggregate home ownership in these areas, so people living in the home they own, you actually detect in these census tracts, in these targeted areas, you detect a decline, a more than 14 percentage point decline in home ownership. When you zoom in, you find that what is going on here is that there was a significant outflow of white homeowners from these targeted areas, which is not being counterbalanced by actually indeed a slight positive effect on Black home ownership, but that's just 0.4 percentage points. So it's completely overwhelmed by the kind of white flight type of behavior. And to make things worse, these effects are exacerbated when generally due to the easing of this conforming loan limit I mentioned, it has become easier in surrounding tracts, still within the same commuting zone, to acquire home ownership. So basically, what the white homeowners are telling themselves is, well, I don't want to stay here anymore, and good luck for me in this kind of better neighborhood. It just became easier to become a homeowner. There's mortgage financing more easily available, so they're extra likely to flee. So in fact, because of the sorting effect, if you look at the aggregate area, at the commuting zone, right, and you plot change in home ownership against ease of mortgage financing, it looks nicely, a little noisy, but it looks positively aligned. But it is in these targeted areas where we're interested in, and these populations we're interested in, where we're not seeing at all a large effect. But still positive if I focus on my Black minority group, which is my focus today, but not exactly overwhelming. And so the conclusion at this point is, well, we have to be careful if we ease access to mortgage financing, having in mind that we want to help the upward mobility of certain populations, because that might allow for white flight out of areas and making kind of the environment potentially worse. And for sure, increasing racial segregation. Well, let's see whether it makes the area worse. So I'm going to be using the Chetty and Cortha definition of upward mobility, basically using the income percentile rank. So take the whole distribution of incomes in the US and look at where the children are in that and compare that to where their parents were. So if your parents were at the 30th percentile, in the US population, and now you're at the 35th or 40s, you had positive upward mobility, vice versa negative. So if I look what happens to families who remain in these targeted tracts, then what I see that there's actually a significant decline in low-income families' upward mobility, the upward mobility of their children. And importantly, this effect is the same, I shouldn't say the same direction for Black families and low-income Black families and low-income white families. So among those who remain, we see that these low-income families have actually on average worse upward mobility. So of course there's a sorting effect going on, but there might also be something else been going on. It affects Blacks and whites. So it doesn't look like discrimination, but it looks like maybe there's some place-based factors we may want to investigate. And as before with the home ownership, this decline is exacerbated when in the surrounding areas it's particularly easy to become a homeowner. Yeah, small aside, I should have mentioned that at the beginning, I apologize. I'm focusing here on the underserved population, so at the low-income families. But as an aside, the effect is actually not offset by like the high-income families doing particularly well due to these policies. So whether you do it on the targeted census tract level, or in this case, even at the overall CZ level, you see a clear negative correlation with increased access to mortgage financing and upward mobility in terms of this children's income measure. Okay, so then, given that I only have a minute or so left, let me quickly just say we then asked the question, so while our main emphasis here is obviously the sorting that's going on and how it's turning these areas where we want to increase opportunities, how it's turning it into opportunity deserts, kind of. We wanted to see, can we distinguish a little bit between the mere sorting, the families going out, and the poorest, the most disadvantaged remaining, or holding constant who's living there, does the place actually kind of get worse? And I mean, of course that interacts, but there's some suggestive evidence of deteriorating place-based factors. We see that house prices, so holding constant the house prices decline, property values decline. We see a decline in school revenues from local sources that may come, from lower property taxes because of the lower house prices, possibly also worsen local economy. And we find a measurable effect in terms of decline in school quality. For example, you can use a teacher-student ratio. And again, that affects both the Black and the white families, everybody who's remaining there. So the net outcome of it all is that segregation increases, and given that these areas are particularly harmful to live in if you are interested in upward mobility, inequality is actually perpetuated in the long term on net. So to kind of summarize, we are in this situation where we have in the 1990s very well-intended home ownership policies. The goal was to not only increase home ownership rates in general, but also to decrease the racial gap in white-Black home ownership or other minorities compared to the white home ownership group. Now, the effect of the policies, as we assess them in the context of the 1992 GSE Act, is that they inadvertently increased racial sorting, decreased upward mobility, and this negative effect can be both measured in the pure GSE Act effect. As soon as I start targeting certain groups, non-minority groups leave, but then it's exacerbated if I actually make access to financing better for everybody. When there's this interaction with this increased conforming loan limit. By the way, there are interesting historical parallels. This is not the first occasion where we could have learned that. So many of you may know these moving to opportunity experiments, right, where people are lifted from high poverty areas, put in better poverty areas. And generally, these smaller scale experiments have often found positive effects on what happens to the kids in terms of upward mobility, educational attainment, etc. But, like that Berencourt did, you can contrast that with if you want so-called large-scale movement to opportunity, looking at the 1940 to 1970 Great Migration, which completely changed the racial composition of many northern cities, and as she argues, turned these opportunity locations into opportunity deserts. So here, of course, it's the sorting of the minority group. What we are pointing out, we also need to take into account the sorting of the non-minority group in an endogenous response to policies. What's the implication? Well, if we can raise awareness, thinking through the sorting effects as people are implementing policies, offering technologies, offering products, that would be a great outcome for us. But if you're asking me concretely in this kind of mortgage application, I would say maybe rethinking when you're doing geographic targeting, what you're doing there, and maybe thinking more about public investment in making disadvantaged neighborhoods better to counter some of these effects, creating opportunity zones. That might be the way to go forward. And I'll stop here.
Hi, yes, it was a question for Ulrike.
Okay,
yeah, I'm wondering if you also think your results are kind of informative about the behavior of the homeowners, the white homeowners who were fleeing, because it was such a small change in Black homeownership and such a large reduction in white homeownership. And so is it a story of like overblown fears in the media, or is it kind of some, these are neighborhoods where, just one Black homeowner was enough to really send all the white homeowners away. It's kind of interesting to think about kind of what model of behavior they're behaving under.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question, given in light, as you're pointing out, of the magnitudes, right? There's been completely overwhelmed by the white sorting behavior. And I have to admit, I haven't studied that particularly. So like I should have acknowledged in a longer talk, there's previous literature studying this act, other acts, and generally finding, oh, given all the dollars we spent on that, why was there so little movement in home ownership? And then now I'm zooming in and I'm finding these huge discrepancies. Yeah, and so your suggestion, could we relate that to maybe variation in how the media covered efforts and maybe in building efforts of like affordable housing in areas or things like that? I think that would be really interesting. And no, unfortunately, I don't have an answer, but I take the suggestion for next steps. Thank you.
I had a question for Ulrike. This could be nitty-gritty, but I don't know if you had a chance to look at once you condition on whether your parent owns a home or not, does that have a differential effect on the upward mobility that you talked about?
Unfortunately, Raj Shetty doesn't share that data. So that's the answer. So I can only do the smallest possible like geographic region and then have to work with percentages. So to kind of, it's an interesting question because there's a fight going on in some sense between like this early literature I was citing, which was saying, oh, homeownership is so great. It has all these causal positive effects. And the second wave saying you guys were all confused in like sorting and actual causal effects. And then now new literature saying, no, I found a quasi-exogenous variation in homeownership. It really works. So I would have loved to look at that also in my setting, like using the GSE Act, but unless somebody lobbies for me with Raj, I can't answer it yet.